Hey guys, this is Ankita from English Test Solution. Today we're going to talk about question number 4 of the TOEFL speaking section. So we're going to start by the general structure of this question, and then I'm going to give you an example and a template that you can follow if you want to answer this question and get a high score. Then I'm going to give you some time breakdown so that you know exactly how much time you need to spend on each part of the question. Then I have actually responded to this question before the presentation, so we're going to listen to my audio and we're going to analyze my response so that you can see how did I use my own template. Then I'm going to give you additional tips for this question, followed by a discussion on what will get you a 26 plus if you need 26, at least a 26 for your professional license. So as you guys might know that starting August 2019, now we only have 4 tasks on the TOEFL speaking. There's 1 independent and 3 integrated tasks, and it's a total of 17 minutes long. The independent task is your question number 1, where they require you to express your opinion on a topic, and there's no reading or listening attached. And then the integrated task is question 2 to question number 4, where they're asking you to combine information from various sources, such as reading and listening. So question number 4 is basically your integrated task, and in this question you listen to a professor, and the professor really talks about a term or a concept or a process and gives you some examples to illustrate that concept. So you just listen to something, there's no reading involved here. Then you get a question, and the question basically asks you to summarize the lecture and demonstrate an understanding of the relationship between the examples and the overall topic. You're given 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to respond. So let's get into the example so that you can see exactly how it looks like. So I've picked an example, and I'm gonna play this audio so that we can do this question together. You know, it's a different thing to listen to multiple or watch multiple YouTube videos, but then when you actually do an example, you learn much more than just watching videos. So I want you to do the question along with me. So I'm gonna play this audio right now.
Now listen to part of a talk in an education class.
One of the hardest parts of teaching is keeping your students' attention. Now, the key to doing this is understanding the concept of attention. Basically, there are 2 types of attention. The first type is active. Active attention is voluntary. It's when you intentionally make yourself focus on something. And since it requires effort, it's hard to keep up for a long time. Okay, so let's say you're teaching a bio.
So like we can see, like so far what they have done is they have explained to us the first concept. So usually there are going to be 2 concepts on this question, and so far she has introduced and explained the first concept, which is active attention.
Biology class. And today's topic is frogs. All right? You're standing at the front of the room and lecturing. A frog is a type of animal known as an amphibian. Well, this isn't necessarily going to keep the students' interest, but most of them will force themselves to pay active attention to your lecture. But it's only a matter of time before they get distracted. Now, the other type of attention is passive attention.
So now we know that she's done with the first example as well. Okay, so we know first concept along with the first example. Now she's going to introduce the second concept.
When it's involuntary. Passive attention requires no effort because it happens naturally. If something's really interesting, students don't have to force themselves to pay attention to it. They do it without even thinking about it. So back to our biology lecture. You start talking about frogs, and then you pull a live frog out of your briefcase. You're describing it while you hold it up. Show the students how long its legs are and how they're used for jumping, for example. Then maybe you even let the frog jump around a bit on the desk or the floor. In this case, by doing something unexpected, something more engaging, you can tap into their passive attention. And it can last much longer than active attention. As long as the frog's still there, your students will be interested.
Okay, so now we heard the second concept, which was passive attention, and she gave an example for that.
Points and examples from the talk. Explain the difference between active and passive attention.
Okay, so that's how question number 4 is usually structured. There are two concepts. They first explain you the first concept with the first example, and then the second concept with the second example. And then you can see here, using points and examples from the talk, explain the differences between active and passive attention. So now you should have been taking notes, and we're not covering note-taking strategy in this training, but otherwise, how you take your notes and what type of information you put in your notes can really help you with responding to the question. So our question is, explain the difference between active and passive attention using the points and examples from the talk, which means you cannot use any of your pre-existing knowledge about the subject. So if you know through your academic courses anything about this topic, do not use that. You have to use the points and the examples from the talk. Now you give it 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to respond. Now I'm going to give you a template that you can use to answer the question. So this is the template you can use. First, always introduce an idea, right? Always introduce what are you going to talk about, right? So today when I started the training, I told you that training is about question number 4. This is what we're going to cover today. When we have a good introduction, the listener knows what's coming up next. So that's why we're going to start by saying, you can say the professor talks about, or you can say the professor mentions that, something like that. So you can say the professor talks about 2 types of attention, that is active and passive attention. That's it. As simple as that. No fancy words involved here. Or you can say the professor mentions that there are 2 types of attention. Now you can also say mentioned, okay? So you can use the past tense, but just make sure that you keep the tense consistent in your response. Then you're going to talk about the first concept. In this case, that was active attention. And you're going to briefly explain what the first concept means. So what is active attention, right? So say, what is active attention? That it is voluntary and there's effort needed, it's kind of forced. And then you're going to explain your first example. Then you're going to transition into your second concept. And in order to do the transition, you can use words such as, on the other hand, passive attention is. Or you can say, in contrast, passive attention is. Something like that. Then you're going to explain the second concept and you're going to give your second example. Again, when you are explaining the second concept, you will just briefly tell us, what is that about? What is passive attention? Now, the biggest problem on especially this question is the time management. A lot of students end up, not being able to cover all the information in 60 seconds. So I'm going to give you exactly how much time you need to spend on each part of the question. So the start and the introduction can take maximum 10 seconds. And it honestly does not take more than that to say a line or 2. Right? So if I say the professor talks about 2 types of attention, active and passive, one sentence really takes, like 5 seconds. So I have given you 10 seconds here because sometimes students take 1 sentence, sometimes 2 sentences to introduce the idea. Then you're going to explain the first concept and the first example in 25 seconds. Then you are going to transition, but this is just a transition word. Like you'll say, on the other hand, passive attention is. Right? So the second concept and second example can take another 25 seconds. Now, remember here, this time management is given to you so that you don't end up spending too much time on either the first concept and first example or the second concept and second example. A lot of students end up spending too much time on this part and then they don't have enough time for this part. Okay, so they're going to end up spending too much time on the first part and not spend enough time on the second part, and then they're not going to get a 26, and we'll discuss about that later, that why that happens and why you won't get a 26 if you do that mistake. Okay, so I'm going to now give you my sample response, and we're not going to just listen to the audio, we're actually going to analyze my response so that you can see how I give a response that uses the template, but still I manage to sound natural, and some of the other things I do. The professor talks about 2 types of attention. So here I really used my template of introducing the idea. That's it. And as I said, in this case, really there was nothing more to say, or I didn't think there was any need to say more about the introduction. So I just made it 1 sentence, which means I didn't even spend 10 seconds. One is the active attention, which is a voluntary attention and it requires effort from students. It is hard to keep that attention for a long period of time. Okay, so what I just said in this part is what I call the first concept, right? So I introduce the first concept, active attention, and I explain what it means. Now I'm going to move on to the first example. For example, if a teacher is teaching a biology class and is talking about frog in a monotonous voice, then it will be really hard for students to pay attention and they're kind of forced to pay attention. Okay, so that was my first example. And there were some words that I stressed more than others. We're going to talk about it later on because I want to explain to you why do you need to stress on some words. Second type is passive attention. It is involuntary and it requires... Okay, so here if you notice that I actually did not use my transition words that I told you about on the other hand or in contrast, because if you need a 26, you cannot memorize a template and follow it blindly. You need to really just use the templates to inspire you to give natural sounding responses. So of course I know my template, I know what I teach, but I necessarily don't have to follow it line by line. And in this case, I just didn't, and it's totally fine. Is no to minimal effort by the students. It is a little bit more natural and is not forced on the students. Okay, now what I did, I just explained the second concept. I said second type is passive attention, it is voluntary and requires no to minimal effort by the students. So this is me explaining the second concept, and now I'm going to get into the get into the example. In this case, in the same biology class, let's say if the professor takes out a real frog from the bag and actually shows a frog and its legs and shows us how it's jumping around, then obviously the students are more engaged. And that type of attention just lasts longer and it's easier for students to maintain. Right? So that is it, right? So see how kind of, I followed some parts of my template, but there were some parts that I didn't follow. But it was natural sounding response. Now let's talk about that. Why did I stress on few words such as about frog in a monotonous voice? It will be really hard for students, kind of forced, no to minimal effort. It's not forced on students. Why did I stress on few words and not others? So the reason is that these are the words that I chose to stress on because they pinpoint the differences between the two types of attention. So when we are speaking English is not like a monotonous language and in the same rhythm. It's not like that. It has its own melody. It has its own rhythm. There are some words that are high pitch and are longer, while there are other words that are low pitch and are shorter. So what happens is by creating stress or by stressing on some of the words, we convey our message in a better way. So I wanted to do that, right? I want the ETS graders to see that I understand the intonation pattern that English language has. So I stress on few words to convey my message in a better way. And I chose these words that I have bold here is because I wanted to pinpoint the differences between the active and the passive attention. Because think about it. Here, active attention is really hard for students. And this one requires no to minimal effort. The active attention is kind of forced, whereas passive attention is not forced. So I chose these words to stress for pinpointing the differences between the two types of attention, and it makes it easier for the listener to understand my message. Okay, so now we're going to get on with some of the additional tips that you need to know for question number 4. Okay, so the first tip is that don't memorize a template, rather sound natural. So yes, so you can memorize a template if you need a high score, but you necessarily don't need a 26. But there are pharmacists, registered nurses, and teachers in some states that do need at least a 26 on the speaking section to get their professional licenses. So if you are one of those, I recommend that you see the template and you use it as an inspiration rather than memorizing it. And even if you have memorized it, make sure that you manage to sound natural and not robotic when you're answering the questions, because usually when we have memorized something, we sound very, like robotic, and it has no rhythm to it. So don't do that. Next one, strategic note-taking is extremely important on this question. Remember, you don't have to say each and every detail. That's another problem with a lot of students, that they end up really summarizing the whole lecture and they start giving these small additional details, exactly what the professor said. So they'll start this introduction on this question by saying, professor talks about that how in teaching the most difficult thing is to keep up your students' attention. So she explains 2 types of attention. No, there's no reason of explaining all of that. You just have to talk about the 2 types of attention, active and passive. So let's get to that quickly. So that's why you don't have to really give each and every detail, but rather you have to give the points that will answer the question that they have asked you. Then the point number 3 is about make sure to spend approximately the same amount of time on both the first and the second concepts. A lot of students end up talking too much about the first concept. That happens a lot. So we're going to go back to this time management here. A lot of students are going to end up talking about the first concept and first example way too much, and then they're not going to have enough time for the second concept and second example. So that's why I provided you the time management, because you need to understand that when there is 25 to 20 seconds left, you need to get on with your second concept. So you just can't spend too much time on this. And that's when you really need to use this time management to see the benefits of it. So, and here that also, entails taking good notes. Like don't write down each and every information in your notes. Rather, write down the information that you will need later on, and utilize that time to really listen to the professor. Now, the last point is about that if you know about the topic beforehand, don't use your pre-existing knowledge. Rather, remember you're only asked to give a response based on what you just heard. Okay, so those are some of the tips. Now you have the template, you know the time management, you know what a response that will get you a very high score looks like. So we're done with that. Now we're going to talk about what will get you a 26 plus. Okay, so in order for you to understand that what will get you a 26 plus, you need to really understand that this is a score that a native English speaker would get if they were to take the TOEFL exam. So don't feel too bad. If you're really stuck at this score, this is a very high level score that you're targeting. There are 3 categories that they are grading you on. First is topic development, second is delivery, and third is language use. Now, there's a lot that goes under each of these categories, but for this video, I'm going to talk about one item under each of the categories. And we've talked a lot of other information such as intonation and time management that kind of falls under one of these. So for topic development, the best way to remember it is 2 C's, completeness and correctness. On question number 4, if you answer the question completely, which means you give equal amount of time on both the first concept and the second concept, that means you have answered the question completely. Okay, make sure that you give enough time to both the concepts and you give the important information that will answer the question that's being asked from you. Now, that is completeness. Correctness means that obviously whatever you are saying needs to be correct, right? So if you are not able to kind of understand the lecture and you give wrong information, that's not going to get you a 26 plus. So you have to obviously understand the information in a correct way and then give the information that will answer the question in a correct way. Let's talk about delivery. So under delivery, there are a lot of things. There's intonation, there's pronunciation, there's are you giving your message in a clear and concise manner? So there's a lot that goes under there. But we're going to today talk about fluency, and within fluency, we're going to talk about one item. that is filler words. So there's a lot of items that go under fluency as well, and there are a lot of things you need to do to be fluent in English, but we're going to talk about one thing, which is filler words, because that's, I think, the most common question that I get. So what are filler words? Filler words are words such as like those sounds, and then also words like like a lot of people do those mistakes. But the thing is, in order to get a 26, you need to reduce those filler words. If you do, let's say, like once or maximum twice in your response, that's fine, okay? But if you do more than that, I highly recommend you work on that problem, because that makes understanding you really difficult, right? So if you stop again and again at wrong places in a sentence, that's going to make it really difficult for somebody to understand you, and then you're going to lose your marks on this delivery piece. Okay, now we're going to talk about the language use. And under language use, you have grammar, which is your spoken grammar, and then also your advanced vocabulary. But for today, we're going to talk about the grammar piece. So a lot of students ask me that on question number 4, do they need to like follow past tense, or do they need to follow present tense? Because they're just thinking that, okay, if I kind of excel in one type of tense, I will be able to give a good response and I will be able to get a 26. But the reality is that on TOEFL speaking section, we automatically switch back and forth between two to three tenses. And if you are going to obviously move back and forth between all these tenses, you need to be really good in all these tenses. And that just doesn't mean understanding, these grammar rules from a book, but also practicing those spoken English and spoken grammar to make sure that you're really, saying the words in the correct grammar. Now, another way of understanding this is that, that how many errors is it, like how many errors are really okay, right? That's another very common question I get, that, what if I make 1 or 2 mistakes, am I going to be okay? Now, remember, if you're going to make like one very small mistake, like a singular plural mistake, and it's only one in a whole response, but then other than that, you had amazing fluency, you were really good in topic development, you had amazing intonation patterns, your pronunciation was great, you used advanced vocabulary. If you did all of that and then you just like had a slip of tongue and you said, a word, like instead of saying students, you said student, that's going to be okay. Okay, that's not a big deal. But the problem happens when you use wrong grammatical structures, and then it changes the meaning of your message, and then you're not going to be able to get a 26. The problem happens when you make like big grammatical errors, which changes the meaning of your message, and that's when you're not going to get a 26, because you're going to lose marks on this language use. So make sure that your grammar is really good, and you're not only just understand the rules from a book, but rather you have practiced spoken English a lot so that you don't make these errors again. Now, I really hope this was helpful. We covered a lot of information. Now you have a template that you can use. You also know how much time you need to spend on each part of this question, and then you listen to my response. And I also kind of talked about intonation patterns in a little bit more detail. And then we talked about additional tips. And now you know what are they really looking for when they give out a 26. So now if you need any more tips, and if you need to know, how you really can get a 26 on the TOEFL speaking section, and you want to get access to my advanced note-taking strategy, I recommend you go on my website, englishtestsolution.com, to get more of these tips. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.